Sometimes the most profound moments in life come disguised as simple acts of kindness. Sister Margaret had spent 40 years opening the chapel doors to anyone seeking shelter, but nothing prepared her for the tiny voice that would shatter her. Quiet evening prayers. A 7-year-old black girl clutching a worn stuffed rabbit whispered desperately, "Please hide my mother tonight." The child's eyes held secrets too heavy for someone so young, and her trembling hands spoke of fears that no child should know. What began as Sister Margaret's instinctive act of mercy quickly became something far more dangerous. The mother's hushed confessions revealed a web of domestic terror and immigration nightmares that stretched back years. As the nun peeled back layers of hidden trauma, she discovered that sometimes protecting the innocent means confronting the darkest parts of human nature. But what happens when the very person meant to offer sanctuary realizes she might be their only hope for survival? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound prayer journal felt heavier in Sister Margaret's weathered hands as she traced the worn edges with her thumb. 43 years of handwritten prayers, reflections, and conversations with the divine filled its yellowed pages, a testament to a life devoted to service that had begun when she was barely 18 and full of righteous certainty about God's will. Now at 61, her certainty had softened into something more profound, wisdom tempered by experience, faith seasoned with doubt, and love deepened by loss. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Chapel, casting jeweled patterns across the simple wooden pews where she had offered comfort to thousands over the decades. St. Catherine's wasn't grand like the cathedral. Downtown, built in 1962 to serve the growing immigrant population in the Riverside neighborhood, it remained purposefully modest, brick exterior weathered to a warm rust color, simple wooden cross above the entrance, and a small garden where Mrs. Chen grew vegetables she shared with anyone who needed them. The chapel held perhaps 60 people when full, but Sister Margaret had learned that sacred space wasn't measured in square footage. Her morning routine had remained unchanged for over 2 decades. 5:30 rise, 20 minutes of silent prayer, in her small apartment above the chapel office, then down to unlock the heavy oak doors. By 6 o'clock, she would have the coffee brewing in the small kitchen behind the altar, not for any formal service, but because she had learned that some of life's most important conversations happened over a warm cup in gentle silence. "Morning, sister." Mrs. Chen's voice carried the melodic accent of her native Guangzhou, softened by 30 years in America. She appeared at the side door, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from her garden, her grey hair neatly braided despite the early hour. "The tomatoes came in beautiful this week. I brought extra for anyone who needs them." "You're too generous." "Lynn." Sister Margaret accepted the basket with genuine gratitude. Mrs. Chen had been her neighbor and unofficial partner in community care since Margaret arrived at St. Catherine's, a retired seamstress who had fled China with her husband in the early 90s. Lynn understood the particular vulnerabilities of immigrants trying to build new lives on foreign ground. Not generous, practical. Lynn's eyes crinkled with familiar humor. "Vegetables go bad if not shared. People go bad if not fed. Simple mathematics." The 2 women had developed an easy rhythm over the years. Lynn would arrive each morning with whatever her garden had produced, and Margaret would ensure it reached the families who needed it most. No paperwork, no questions asked, no judgment rendered. It was a system that had fed hundreds of people and strengthened the quiet bonds that held their small community together. Father Rodriguez appeared from the church office, his graying hair slightly disheveled from his habit of running his hands through it while reviewing the week's schedule. At 55, he carried himself with the slight stoop of a man who had spent decades bending down to meet children at eye level and listen to confessions whispered in shame. His ordination had come later in life, after a career as a high school guidance counselor, and he brought a practical understanding of human nature that complemented Margaret's more mystical approach to faith. "The Gutierrez family called last night," he said, accepting the cup of coffee Margaret offered. "Maria's hours got cut again at the hotel. They're worried about making rent next month." Sister Margaret nodded, mentally calculating the funds available in their discretionary assistance account. It wasn't much. St. Catherine's operated on a shoestring budget even in good months, but they had learned to stretch every dollar with the skill of parents feeding large families on small incomes. "I'll stop by this afternoon," she said. "Sometimes Maria just needs someone to listen while she figures out her next steps." This was the rhythm of their days. Coffee, quiet planning, and the steady work of bearing witness to their neighbors' struggles. Margaret had long ago abandoned any fantasy of dramatic conversions or miraculous healings. Real ministry, she had learned, happened in grocery money quietly left on kitchen tables, in immigration forms filled out with patient hands, and in doors that stayed unlocked when the world outside grew cold. The neighborhoods surrounding St. Catherine's reflected the complex demographics of urban America. Honduran families lived next to elderly Irish widows who had watched their parish change languages, but not its essential character. Somali refugees shared apartment hallways with Mexican day laborers, and their children played together in the small park across from the chapel, switching effortlessly between Spanish, Arabic, and English as they negotiated the rules of playground. Politics. Margaret had baptized many of these children, watched them grow through First Communion and Confirmation, celebrated their high school graduations, and mourned with their families when some were lost to violence, addiction, or simply the grinding poverty that made every day a battle for dignity. Each name in her prayer journal carried the weight of a full human story, triumphs and failures, hopes sustained, and dreams deferred. "Remember when we thought our biggest challenge would be language barriers?" Father Rodriguez asked, settling into the worn armchair in Margaret's small office. The question carried the weight of shared history. When they had first partnered 15 years ago, their primary concern had been finding enough Spanish-speaking volunteers to help with translation during services. Now we have families speaking 6 different languages, dealing with trauma we can barely imagine, and half of them afraid to trust anyone in authority, Margaret replied, opening her journal to the day's prayer requests. "Sometimes I wonder if we're making any real difference." It was an honest admission that would have shocked the younger version of herself, the idealistic novice who had been certain that faith and good intentions could overcome any obstacle. Age and experience had taught her that the world's wounds ran deeper than simple charity could heal, and that sometimes the most faithful response to suffering was simply to sit with it, offering presence rather than solutions. "You know what Mrs. Okafor told me yesterday?" Father Rodriguez asked. "She said that when her husband was dying, the thing that helped most wasn't the hospital chaplain or the grief counselors. It was knowing that every morning at 6 o'clock you would unlock those doors and she could come sit in silence with God. She said it felt like you were keeping watch over the neighborhood's sorrows." Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came when someone put words to the inexplicable sense of calling that had guided her life. She had never been the most eloquent preacher or the most theologically sophisticated nun, but she had learned to be present, to hold space for others' pain without trying to fix it, to offer welcome without requiring explanation, and to trust that love expressed through simple actions could indeed be a form of prayer. The phone rang, interrupting her reflection. Father Rodriguez answered with his customary gentleness. "St. Catherine's, this is Father Rodriguez." His expression shifted as he listened, and he reached for a pen to take notes. "Yes, we can help with that. Let me connect you with Sister Margaret." He handed her the phone with a slight frown. "Immigration lawyer, calling about emergency placement for a family. Sister Margaret speaking." She listened as the lawyer, Maria Santos, explained the situation in rapid Spanish, interspersed with English. A woman and her young daughter needed immediate safe housing, domestic violence situation complicated by immigration status. The usual shelters were full, and the family was afraid to involve police due to the mother's undocumented status. "How old is the child?" Margaret asked, already knowing she would say yes, regardless of the complications. 7 years old. The mother is a teacher from El Salvador, very educated, but her visa expired 2 years ago. The boyfriend has been using her legal status as a weapon. They left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Margaret looked at Father Rodriguez, who nodded before she even asked the question. 40 years of partnership with various priests had taught her that some decisions transcended official policies. When someone was in danger, bureaucracy became a luxury they couldn't afford. Bring them tonight after evening prayer. Bring them tonight after evening prayer. We'll have the basement room ready. After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly for a moment, feeling the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that came with opening their doors to new need. Each family brought their own constellation of challenges, and she had learned not to make assumptions about how their stories would unfold. Some stays lasted a night, others stretched into months, and a few had resulted in permanent additions to their small community. The basement room hasn't been used since the Nguyen family moved into their own apartment, Father Rodriguez said, already mentally cataloguing what supplies they would need. "I'll check the heating and make sure the bed is made up. I'll ask Lynn to prepare some food, and we should call Dr. Martinez. If there's been violence, the mother might need medical attention." These preparations had become second nature over the years. St. Catherine's operated an informal network of doctors, lawyers, teachers, and social workers who understood that some help needed to be given quietly, without forms to fill out or questions that might endanger vulnerable people. It was a system built on trust, sustained by shared commitment to the belief that everyone deserved safety and dignity. As the day progressed, Margaret found her thoughts returning to the unnamed woman and child who would arrive that evening. In her experience, the circumstances that brought people to their door were rarely simple, and domestic violence cases carried particular complexities. Fear often made victims reluctant to accept help, and abusers sometimes followed their targets with persistent determination. But tonight, as she had done thousands of times before, she would unlock the door and offer what St. Catherine's had always provided: sanctuary without questions, welcome without judgment, and the simple promise that whatever brought them here, they would not face it alone. Evening prayer at St. Catherine's was never a formal affair. Sister Margaret preferred the intimacy of simple conversation with the divine, speaking aloud in the empty chapel as twilight painted the stained glass in deeper hues. She had just begun her customary reflection on the day's small mercies when she heard the soft scraping of the heavy oak door opening behind her. "We're closed for the evening, but you're welcome to sit quietly if you need a moment," she said without turning around, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to welcoming strangers. The silence stretched longer than usual. Margaret was about to turn when she heard it, a whisper so soft it might have been mistaken for the settling of old wood, except for the trembling desperation that carried across the empty pews. "Sister, please hide my mother tonight." Margaret's heart stopped. In 40 years of ministry, she had heard countless pleas for help, but never from a voice so young, so carefully controlled, despite obvious terror. She turned slowly, not wanting to startle whoever had spoken. A small girl stood silhouetted in the doorway, clutching something against her chest. Even in the dim light, Margaret could see the child's thin frame, The way she held herself as if ready to run, and the protective stance that spoke of experience with danger, the object in her arms resolved into a stuffed rabbit, brown fabric worn thin from countless nights of fearful clutching. "Hello, sweetheart." Margaret kept her voice soft, the tone she had perfected for frightened children over decades of practice. "What's your name?" "Esperanza." The girl stepped forward hesitantly, and Margaret could see her more clearly now. 7 years old, perhaps 8, with intelligent dark eyes that held too much knowledge of adult cruelties. Her clothes were clean, but mismatched, as if dressed hastily from whatever was available. "That's a beautiful name. It means hope." Margaret remained seated in her pew, understanding that sudden movements might send the child fleeing. "Where is your mother, Esperanza?" "Outside. She's scared to come in. She thinks maybe you won't help us because we don't have papers." The words tumbled out in accented English, each syllable carefully pronounced, as if practicing a crucial speech. "You ask your mother to come inside? It's getting cold, and I think we should all sit together and talk." Esperanza nodded and ran back to the door. Margaret heard hushed Spanish conversation, the child's voice insistent, an adult's voice reluctant and fearful. After several minutes, 2 figures appeared in the doorway. The woman who entered behind Esperanza moved like someone expecting attack from any direction. Rosa, though Margaret didn't know her name yet, was perhaps 30, with the strong hands and careful posture of someone who had worked hard for everything she possessed. But it was her face that made Margaret's breath catch. Even in the chapel's forgiving light, the bruising around her left eye was unmistakable, dark purple fading to yellow at the edges. "Please, sit," Margaret said, gesturing to the pew beside her. "You're safe here." Rosa's eyes darted around the chapel before settling on Margaret's face, searching for judgment and finding only patient compassion. She sat on the very edge of the pew, muscles coiled for flight, while Esperanza pressed close against her side. "My daughter. She said you help people," Rosa began, her English heavily accented but clear. "We have nowhere else to go." "What happened?" "To your face?" Margaret asked gently. Rosa's hand moved instinctively to cover the bruises, a gesture so automatic it spoke of repeated injuries carefully hidden. "My boyfriend, he gets angry sometimes. Last night he was very angry." "Are you hurt anywhere else?" "My ribs, they hurt when I breathe deep, but nothing broken, I think." Rosa's clinical assessment of her own injuries suggested this was not the first time she had catalogued damage to her body. Margaret felt the familiar fire of righteous anger that always rose when she encountered evidence of violence against the vulnerable. 40 years of ministry had not inured her to the sight of deliberate cruelty, particularly when it targeted women and children who had few resources for protection. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" "No." "Miguel, he knows all the places. I might go. My friends, they try to help, but he threatens them too. And I cannot go to police because—" Rosa's voice broke and she looked at Esperanza with the particular anguish of a mother who cannot protect her child. "Because of your immigration status," Margaret finished quietly. Rosa nodded, tears starting to flow despite obvious efforts to maintain composure. "He says if I try to leave, he will call immigration. He says they will take Esperanza from me and send us back to El Salvador. And there we will have nothing. No family left. No money. No safety." The cracked cell phone Rosa pulled from her pocket looked like it had been thrown against a wall. The screen was spiderwebbed with fractures, but it still functioned. With trembling fingers, she showed Margaret a series of text messages. "Where are you, Pera?" Read the first message, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. the previous night. "You can't." "Hide from me. I know where your friends live," came another at 1:23 a.m. "Maybe I should pay them a visit. Bring back my girl or I call ICE tomorrow. Your choice." Margaret read the messages with growing horror, recognizing the calculated cruelty of someone who understood exactly which threats would cause maximum in psychological damage. This wasn't random violence. It was systematic control exercised by someone who had clearly studied Rosa's vulnerabilities and weaponized them. "How long has this been going on?" Margaret asked. 2 years since I met him. At first, he was kind. He said he would help me get papers, help me make life here for Esperanza. But then he changed. He started to control everything, where I go, who I talk to, what job I can have, and when I don't obey. Rosa gestured to her bruised face. Esperanza, who had been silent throughout this conversation, suddenly spoke up. "He hurt Mama when she tried to help me with homework. He said I don't need school, that immigrant children should just be grateful." The casual cruelty of denying education to a child struck Margaret with particular force. She had seen too many bright minds dimmed by poverty and prejudice, too many dreams deferred because someone had decided that certain children didn't deserve the same opportunities as others. "You were right to leave," Margaret said firmly. "And Esperanza was right to ask for help. We can provide you with a safe place to stay tonight, and tomorrow we'll start figuring out longer-term solutions. But the law, if they find out you help us, there are laws written by legislators, and there are laws written by love," Margaret interrupted gently. "In 40 years of ministry, I've learned that when those laws conflict, I'm called to choose love." She stood and moved to the small office behind the altar, returning with a set of keys. "There's a basement room we use for families who need temporary shelter. It has a bed, a small bathroom, and complete privacy. The entrance is through the side door, and you can lock it from the inside." Rosa stared at the keys as if they represented something far more valuable than simple metal and plastic. "You don't know us. We could be anyone. Why would you trust us?" "Because 30 years ago, I was told that faith without works is dead," Margaret replied. "And because that little girl asked me to hide her mother, and I've never been able to say no to a child who needs protection." As they gathered Rosa's single bag and prepared to move to the basement room, Margaret noticed how Esperanza stayed between her mother and any potential exits, how Rosa flinched at sudden sounds, how both of them moved with the hypervigilance of prey animals. The damage visible on Rosa's face was only the surface manifestation of wounds that ran much deeper. "Tomorrow we'll call a doctor to look at your ribs," Margaret said as she showed them the basement space. "And we have lawyers who work with immigrant families, people who understand your situation and can explain your options without judging your choices." "What if he finds us here?" Rosa asked, testing the lock on the door multiple times. "Then we'll deal with that problem when it comes," Margaret replied, with more confidence than she felt. In truth, she had no idea what they would do if Miguel appeared at St. Catherine's demanding Rosa's return. But 40 years of ministry had taught her that some promises had to be made before you knew how to keep them, trusting that wisdom and courage would emerge when they were needed. As she climbed the stairs back to her own apartment, Margaret felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. By morning, she would need to contact Dr. Martinez about Rosa's injuries, call Maria Santos about legal options, and begin the delicate work of helping a traumatized family rebuild their lives while staying one step ahead of someone who seemed determined to destroy them. But tonight, for the first time in months, Rosa and Esperanza would sleep without fear of violence. And sometimes, Margaret reflected as she prepared for her own prayers, that small mercy was enough to justify whatever complications tomorrow might bring. Sister Margaret woke before dawn with the particular heaviness that came from sleeping with one ear always listening. The basement room was directly below her small apartment, and every creak of settling wood had made her wonder if Rosa and Esperanza were truly safe, or if someone was moving through the chapel in the darkness. She dressed quietly and made her way downstairs to start the coffee. Her morning routine now waited with new purpose. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mrs. Chen already working in her garden, the elderly woman's movements efficient despite the early hour. The familiar sight brought comfort. In a world that seemed increasingly unpredictable, Lin's steady presence remained a constant. A soft knock on the basement door interrupted her thoughts. Rosa emerged, looking as if she hadn't slept despite the safety of locked doors. Her movements were careful, protective of injured ribs, and her eyes held the hyper-alert quality of someone who had learned not to trust in safety. "I'm sorry to bother you so early," Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Esperanza, she had nightmares. She's sleeping now, but I couldn't stay still anymore. No need to apologize. Would you like some coffee?" Rosa nodded gratefully, settling into one of the kitchen chairs with visible relief at being able to sit without watching doorways. In the morning light, Margaret could see more details of the life Rosa had fled. Her clothes were well cared for, but worn, the kind of careful mending that spoke of making do with very little. Her hands, wrapped around the warm coffee cup, were those of someone who had worked hard. Small scars, calloused fingertips, nails kept short and practical. "Tell me about El Salvador," Margaret said gently. "What was your life like before you came here?" Rosa's expression softened slightly, accessing memories that carried less pain than recent experiences. "I was a teacher at a primary school in San Salvador. Mathematics and reading. I loved my students. They were so eager to learn, even when they had so little." "What brought you to the United States?" The softness disappeared from Rosa's face. "Gang violence got very bad in our neighborhood. They were recruiting children as young as 8, and the police couldn't or wouldn't stop it. When they started targeting Esperanza, she was only 5, but they said smart children could be useful. I knew we had to leave." Margaret had heard similar stories from other Central American families, but the repetition never diminished her horror at the impossible choices parents faced. "How did you manage the journey?" "We walked for 3 weeks, mostly at night." Esperanza was so brave. She never complained, even when her feet were bleeding. Rosa pulled a folded document from her pocket, handling it with the reverence reserved for precious objects. "This is my expired visa. I was a visiting teacher in a program that was supposed to last 2 years. But then the funding was cut, and suddenly I was, what do you call it, undocumented." The faded immigration document told a story that Margaret had seen repeated too many times. Rosa had entered the country legally, with skills and education that should have made her a welcome addition to any community, but bureaucratic changes and policy shifts had transformed her from legal visitor to vulnerable target, prey for anyone who understood how to exploit the fear that came with uncertain status. "The program promised help with permanent residency," Rosa continued. "But when it ended, I was told to just go home, as if home was still safe, as if Esperanza could just go back to a place where children disappear in the night." "So you stayed." "I cleaned offices at night, taught English to other immigrants during the day. We lived in one room above a restaurant, but we were safe. Esperanza went to school, learned English so fast it amazed me. For 3 years, we built a life. And then you met Miguel." Rosa's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "He seemed like an answer to prayer. Older, stable, said he had connections who could help with my legal status. He was charming with Esperanza, brought her books and toys. I thought..." Her voice broke slightly. "I thought maybe God had finally sent us someone who would help us belong here." The pattern was devastatingly familiar to Margaret. Predators who targeted vulnerable women understood exactly which promises would bypass normal caution: safety for their children, legitimacy in a country that treated them as unwelcome, the simple human need for partnership in an isolating world. "When Daesh, did things change?" slowly at first. He said I shouldn't work so much, that he would take care of us, but then he wanted to know where I went, who I talked to. He said other immigrants were bad influences, that I should be grateful for his help instead of maintaining old friendships. Rosa traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. By the time I realized what was happening, I felt trapped. He knew about my expired visa, about my fear of deportation, and Esperanza had grown attached to him. The door to the basement room opened quietly, and Esperanza appeared, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit. Her hair was mussed from sleep, but her eyes were alert, scanning the kitchen before focusing on her mother. "Mama, you left." "I'm right here, mi amor." Sister Margaret made coffee, and we were just talking. Esperanza approached cautiously, the way children learn to move when adult emotions are unpredictable. But something about Margaret's calm presence seemed to reassure her, and she climbed into the chair next to Rosa. "Are you hungry, sweetheart?" Margaret asked. "I think Mrs. Chen brought fresh bread yesterday." While Margaret prepared a simple breakfast, she observed the careful dance between mother and daughter. Esperanza's attention was constantly divided between her own needs and monitoring Rosa's emotional state. Rosa, meanwhile, maintained a facade of calm strength that clearly cost her significant effort. Both of them moved through the world with the exhausting hypervigilance of people who had learned that safety was temporary and danger could appear without warning. "Sister Margaret," Esperanza said suddenly, her voice carrying the particular clarity that children brought to complicated adult situations. "Miguel said we don't deserve to stay in America. He said we should be grateful for any help because we're not real Americans." The casual cruelty of using a child's desire to belong as a weapon of control struck Margaret with particular force. She had seen too many immigrant children absorb these messages, learning to see themselves as somehow less deserving of basic dignity and opportunity. "What do you think about that?" Margaret asked gently. Esperanza considered the question seriously. "I think I was born in El Salvador, but I learned to read here. I learned about science and art and music here. My friends are here, and my teacher says I'm good at mathematics. I think maybe home is where you learn to be yourself." Rosa's eyes filled with tears at her daughter's simple wisdom. "See why I couldn't let them take her from me. She understands things that adults forget." Mrs. Chen appeared at the kitchen door, carrying her daily basket of vegetables and radiating the practical warmth that had made her Margaret's trusted partner in community care. "Good morning," she said, taking in the scene with quick assessment. "I brought extra eggs this morning. Children need protein when they're growing." Within minutes, Lynn had transformed Margaret's simple breakfast into a proper meal, moving around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had fed many hungry people over the years. She asked no questions about Rosa and Esperanza's presence, but her actions made clear that they were now under the protection of the informal network that sustained St. Catherine's most vulnerable visitors. "My husband and I came here with nothing but hope," Lynn said as she scrambled eggs. "People helped us when we had no right to expect help. Now we help others. This is how community works." As they shared breakfast in the morning light, Margaret felt the familiar sense of pieces falling into place that often accompanied her work with families in crisis. Rosa and Esperanza's immediate physical safety was established, but the work of building sustainable security would require careful planning and the coordination of resources that existed largely outside official channels. But watching Esperanza eat with the first genuine appetite she had probably felt in days, and seeing Rosa's shoulders relax slightly in the presence of unconditional welcome, Margaret was reminded that every journey toward healing began with simple acts of care: hot coffee, warm bread, and the radical promise that whatever brought them here, they would not face it alone. 3 days into their stay at St. Catherine's, Esperanza finally began to speak about the bad man without the careful euphemisms that had marked her earlier references to Miguel. It happened while she was helping Sister Margaret arrange flowers for the altar, a task that seemed to calm the child's restless energy and provide safe space for difficult conversations. He used to lock Mama in the bedroom when she made him angry, Esperanza said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. Her small hands carefully trimmed flower stems with scissors that seemed too large for her fingers. I would sit outside the door and sing songs so she wouldn't feel alone. Margaret's hands stilled on the roses she was arranging. That must have been very frightening for you. I wasn't scared for me. He was always nice to me when other people were watching. But when we were alone, he would tell me things about Mama, that she was ungrateful, that she didn't deserve to stay in America, that maybe I would be better off without her. Esperanza's voice remained steady, but her grip on the scissors tightened. I knew he was lying, but sometimes I worried that maybe other people believed him. The sophisticated psychological manipulation described by a 7-year-old chilled Margaret to her core. Miguel's tactics revealed the calculated approach of someone who understood that isolating victims required convincing them that no one else would believe or support them. Did you ever tell anyone what was happening at home? Mama said we couldn't tell anyone because Miguel knew people who could make us disappear. He showed me pictures on his phone of families being taken away by police, and he said that's what happens to children whose mothers don't behave. Margaret had arranged for Dr. Martinez to examine Rosa the previous evening. The gentle family physician had confirmed that while Rosa's ribs were badly bruised, nothing was broken. But he had also identified older injuries, a poorly healed fracture in her left wrist, scar tissue suggesting repeated trauma to her abdomen. The physical evidence painted a picture of systematic abuse that had escalated over months. Would you like to help me with something special? Margaret asked, reaching for a piece of paper and crayons she kept in her desk for young visitors. I'm making a prayer list for families who need extra blessings. Could you draw a picture of what safety looks like to you? Esperanza considered this request seriously before settling at the small table in Margaret's office. She worked with intense concentration, occasionally glancing up to gauge Margaret's reaction to her artistic choices. After 20 minutes, she pushed the completed drawing across the table. The image stopped Margaret's breath. Esperanza had drawn a house, but unlike typical children's drawings that featured windows looking out onto sunny skies, this house had no windows at all. Just solid walls, a firmly closed door, and a small garden behind a high fence. Inside the house, 3 stick figures sat around a table, a woman, a child, and another figure that might have been Margaret herself, distinguished by what appeared to be a cross around her neck. It's a safe house, Esperanza explained. No windows, so no one can see inside. No one can find us, and we can just be together without being scared. The drawing revealed the depth of trauma that couldn't be measured in bruises or broken bones. This child had learned to equate safety with invisibility, protection with isolation. Her vision of security was a world where they could exist without being seen, because being seen meant being vulnerable to harm. This is a beautiful drawing, Margaret said carefully. But can I ask you something? What do you think it would be? Like to live in a house that did have windows, but where the people inside were so safe that they didn't need to hide. Esperanza's brow furrowed as she considered this concept. I don't know. I think maybe that's just for other families. Families who belong here already. The internalized sense of illegitimacy in the child's response broke Margaret's heart. Esperanza had absorbed the message that safety and belonging were privileges reserved for others, not rights she could claim for herself. Rosa appeared in the doorway, moving with the careful gait of someone whose ribs protested sudden movements. Over the past few days, she had begun to relax slightly, But Margaret noticed that she still positioned herself where she could see both entrances to any room and never sat with her back to a door. "How are my girls doing?" Rosa asked, settling into the chair beside Esperanza and examining the drawing with genuine interest. "What a lovely house, mi amor. Mama, do you think we'll ever have a house with windows?" Esperanza asked with the directness that children brought to questions adults found too painful to voice. Rosa's composure wavered for a moment before she gathered herself. "I think maybe someday we'll be safe enough to let light in," she said. Carefully, Margaret stood and moved to the window that looked out over Mrs. Chen's garden. "Rosa, I've been thinking about what you told me about your teaching background. The community center 3 blocks from here offers ESL classes, but they're always looking for qualified instructors. Would you be interested in meeting the director?" The suggestion seemed to surprise Rosa. "You think they would hire someone like me, without proper papers?" "I think they would hire someone with your qualifications and your heart for teaching. The immigration paperwork, that's a separate issue we can work on with lawyers. But your skills and your calling to educate, those don't depend on documentation status." Over the past 3 days, Margaret had made several calls to her network of contacts in immigrant services. The legal picture was complex, but not hopeless. Rosa's expired visa and years of undocumented residence created challenges, but her lack of criminal record, her professional background, and the domestic violence she had suffered opened several potential pathways to legal status. "There's something else I want to discuss," Margaret continued. "I've spoken with Maria Santos, the immigration lawyer I mentioned. She believes we can build a strong case for protective status based on the domestic violence and your situation in El Salvador. But it will take time, and during that process, you'll need to be able to support yourself and Esperanza." "How long?" Rosa asked, the practical question of someone who had learned to plan for survival one day at a time. "Maybe 18 months to 2 years for full resolution. But there are steps we can take immediately to get you work authorization and temporary protection from deportation." For the first time since arriving at St. Catherine's, Rosa's expression shifted from fear towards something that might have been cautious hope. "You really think this is possible?" "I think you have every right to build a life here for yourself and Esperanza. And I think this community is stronger when it includes people like you. Educators who care about children, mothers who fight for their families, women who refuse to accept that violence is inevitable." Esperanza looked up from her drawing. "Sister Margaret, if we stayed here, could I keep going to school? Not only could you keep going to school, but I think you're going to excel in ways that will amaze everyone. Your mother has given you gifts, intelligence, resilience, and compassion that will serve you well no matter what challenges come." As they sat together in the afternoon light, Margaret felt the familiar sense of pieces beginning to align that often preceded breakthrough moments in her work with families. Rosa and Esperanza's immediate crisis had been addressed, but now came the harder work of building sustainable safety and genuine belonging. The drawing Esperanza had created, a house without windows, would remain on Margaret's bulletin board as a reminder of what trauma could steal from children, and as a prayer for the day when this remarkable little girl would feel safe enough to let light into her world again. Sister Margaret's mother's rosary had lost 3 beads over the decades, 2 from daily use and 1 from the day Margaret had clutched it so tightly during her father's funeral that the wire snapped. She held it now in the pre-dawn darkness of her apartment, running her thumb over the smooth, worn spots where countless prayers had been offered, seeking the same comfort it had provided her mother through 60 years of joys and sorrows. The rosary had come to America with her Irish grandmother in 1923, passed down through 3 generations of women who had found strength in its familiar rhythm. Now, as Margaret faced criticism from some parishioners about harboring illegals, she drew on the same stubborn faith that had sustained the women before her. "My grandmother used to say that when the world gets smaller, our hearts have to get bigger," Margaret murmured to the darkness, beginning the prayers that had shaped her morning routine for 4 decades. The controversy had started 3 weeks after Rosa began teaching ESL classes at the community centre. Word spread quickly in their tight-knit neighbourhood. The nun at St. Catherine's was helping an undocumented woman, providing sanctuary that some viewed as law-breaking rather than mercy. The criticism came primarily from long-time parishioners who had watched their neighbourhood change and felt that their own struggles were being overlooked in favour of newcomers. Frank Morrison, whose family had attended St. Catherine's for 40 years, had been particularly vocal. A retired factory worker struggling on a fixed income, he represented the complicated demographics of urban Catholic parishes where long-time residents and recent immigrants often competed for the same limited resources. "Sister, I respect what you're trying to do," he had said after Mass the previous Sunday, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone trying to remain respectful while expressing deep disagreement. "But my grandson can't get into the community college program because they're giving preference to ESL students. My daughter lost her job at the hotel when they hired cheaper workers who don't have papers. When do we start taking care of our own?" Margaret had listened with the patience developed through decades of pastoral care, understanding that Frank's concerns reflected genuine economic anxiety rather than simple prejudice. The prosperity that had once sustained working-class Catholic neighborhoods had been declining for years, and fear about the future often expressed itself as resentment toward those who seemed to be receiving help. "I understand your frustration, Frank," she had replied, "but Rosa isn't taking anything away from your family. She's contributing, teaching children to read, volunteering at the food pantry, helping elderly neighbors with translation. The problems your family is facing are real, but they're not caused by people like Rosa." The conversation had remained civil, but Margaret sensed the deeper tensions that her decision to help Rosa had exposed. St. Catherine's had always served a diverse community, but the economic pressures of recent years had created new fault lines that challenged the parish's tradition of welcome. Father Rodriguez shared her concerns. "I had 3 families approach me this week about the immigration situation," he reported during their morning coffee meeting. "The Kowalskis want to know if helping undocumented families means we're breaking federal law. The Garcias are worried that INE agents might show up at church, and Mrs. Patterson asked if we're becoming too political." These were the conversations that kept Margaret awake at night, not because she doubted her decision to help Rosa and Esperanza, but because she understood the legitimate fears of long-time parishioners who felt caught between economic pressures and moral obligations they weren't sure how to navigate. The legal consultation with Maria Santos had provided both hope and concern. Rosa's case for protected status was strong. Her documented history of domestic violence, her professional background, and the continued danger she faced in El Salvador all supported her application. But the process would take time, and during that period, Rosa remained vulnerable to deportation if discovered by immigration authorities. The good news is that ICE rarely conducts raids at churches, Maria had explained during their meeting in Margaret's office. Religious institutions are generally considered sensitive locations, but that protection is more custom than law, and it could change. Rosa had listened to this assessment with the stoic acceptance of someone who had learned not to expect guarantees. "What does this mean for daily life? For Esperanza's school? You can apply for work authorization while your case is pending. The community center job helps establish your ties to the area and your contributions to society. Esperanza's school enrollment is protected regardless of your status. Children have a right to education, but you'll need to be careful about travel, even within the state. The restrictions meant that Rosa's world remained small and carefully circumscribed. She could walk to the community center, take Esperanza to school, shop for groceries in the immediate neighborhood. But family emergencies in other cities, job opportunities beyond walking distance, even simple pleasures like visiting museums or parks in other parts of town carried risks that documented residents never had to consider. Margaret watched Rosa navigate these limitations with quiet dignity, but she also saw the toll that constant vigilance took. Rosa's shoulders had begun to relax during her first weeks at St. Catherine's, but news coverage of immigration raids in neighboring cities had restored the familiar tension. She moved through the world like someone who had learned that safety was always temporary. Esperanza, meanwhile, was thriving in ways that both delighted and concerned Margaret. The child had enrolled at Thomas Jefferson Elementary with Margaret's assistance, and her teachers reported that she was exceptionally bright and eager to learn. But she also displayed behaviors that spoke to her complicated home life: hypervigilance around strangers, reluctance to discuss family during class, sharing time, and an unusual degree of responsibility for her mother's emotional well-being. "She asked me yesterday if I thought her English was good enough," Rosa confided during one of their evening conversations. "I told her it was wonderful, but she said she wanted to be perfect, so people wouldn't know we didn't belong here." The pressure that a 7-year-old felt to prove her worthiness to remain in the only country she truly knew represented one of the cruelest aspects of their situation. Esperanza was absorbing adult anxieties about documentation and belonging, translating them into a child's conviction that she needed to be exceptional to justify her existence in America. Margaret had begun working with Dr. Sarah Kim, a pediatric counselor who specialized in trauma therapy for immigrant children. The sessions were conducted in both English and Spanish, allowing Esperanza to express fears that she couldn't yet articulate in her second language. "She's remarkably resilient," Dr. Kim reported after their third session. "But she's also carrying responsibility that no child should bear. She sees herself as her mother's protector, which is common in families where the parent is struggling with trauma. The goal is to help her reclaim some childhood while building healthy coping skills." The community center where Rosa taught had become an unexpected source of both support and complications. The director, Carmen Rodriguez, was herself a former, undocumented immigrant who had achieved legal status through marriage to a U.S. citizen. She understood Rosa's situation intimately and had created an environment where Rosa could contribute meaningfully to the community while building the professional network that might eventually support her path to legal residency. But the center also attracted attention from immigration hardliners who viewed ESL programs as enabling illegal presence rather than facilitating integration. Anonymous complaints had been filed about the center's hiring practices, and local news coverage of Rosa's story had brought both support and backlash. "We've had 3 families drop out of the program this week," Carmen reported during her weekly check-in with Margaret. "Their employers threatened to fire them if they were seen at the center. But we've also had 6 new volunteers sign up to help with childcare and translation services. The community is polarized, but more people want to help than want to cause harm." As Margaret prepared for evening prayer, she reflected on the complexity of moral action in a world where good intentions could have unintended consequences. Her decision to help Rosa and Esperanza had been unambiguous, a clear call to protect the vulnerable. But the ripple effects of that decision had revealed how deeply immigration fears had penetrated every aspect of community life, creating divisions between neighbors who might otherwise share common cause. The restraining order arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a court clerk who seemed embarrassed by the thinness of the document that was supposed to provide protection against a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to ignore laws. Rosa held the single sheet of paper with trembling hands, reading the legal language that prohibited Miguel from contacting, approaching, or harassing her and Esperanza. "This will help," Maria Santos said with less conviction than her words suggested. The immigration lawyer had worked with enough domestic violence cases to understand the limitations of court orders when dealing with determined abusers. It establishes a legal record of the threat you face, which strengthens your case for protected status, and it gives police clear grounds for arrest if he violates the terms. Sister Margaret watched Rosa's face as she processed this information. 6 weeks at St. Catherine's had allowed some of Rosa's natural confidence to resurface. She was teaching 3 ESL classes now and had been elected to the community center's advisory board, but the restraining order seemed to remind her that safety remained fragile and contingent. "What if he doesn't care about papers?" Rosa asked quietly. "What if this just makes him angrier?" It was the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. Margaret had seen too many women killed by partners who viewed restraining orders as challenges rather than boundaries. The document in Rosa's hands represented the formal limits of legal protection. Beyond this point, safety depended on community vigilance, personal caution, and hope that the system would respond quickly enough to matter. Father Rodriguez had arranged for discreet security improvements at St. Catherine's. New locks had been installed on all entrances, motion sensor lights added to the parking area, and a simple alarm system connected directly to the local police station. The parish council had approved these expenses without debate, understanding that the chapel's traditional role as sanctuary required practical as well as spiritual preparation. "The thing that worries me most," Margaret confided to Father Rodriguez during their morning planning session, "is that Miguel knows Rosa's patterns now. He knows she teaches at the community center, knows Esperanza's school schedule, knows where we shop for groceries. A restraining order doesn't change any of that knowledge." Carmen Rodriguez had begun varying Rosa's teaching schedule and arranging for different volunteers to walk her to and from the center. Mrs. Chen had organized an informal neighborhood watch with long-time residents keeping casual eyes on anyone who seemed to be observing the chapel or asking questions about its inhabitants. The community was mobilizing to protect Rosa and Esperanza, but their efforts highlighted how vulnerable the family remained. Esperanza's nightmares had returned with the filing of the restraining order. Dr. Kim explained that legal proceedings often triggered trauma responses in children, even when those proceedings were intended to provide protection. "She's been having dreams about policemen taking her mother away," Rosa reported during one of their evening conversations. "I try to explain that these police are different, that they want to help us, but she's seen too much of what happens when authorities get involved in our lives." The child's fear was rooted in experience that contradicted adult reassurances about safety and justice. Esperanza had lived through her mother's terror of deportation, had heard Miguel's threats about calling immigration authorities, had absorbed the message that police and courts were more likely to separate families than protect them. The restraining order, meant to provide security, felt to a 7-year-old like another official document that could be used against them. Margaret had begun spending more time with Esperanza after school, helping with homework and providing the stable adult presence that traumatized children needed. Their afternoon sessions had become a cherished routine. Esperanza would arrive at the chapel at 3:30, settle at the small table in Margaret's office, and work through math problems while sharing the casual observations that revealed her remarkable resilience. Mrs. Patterson told Tommy at school that his mom shouldn't hire people like mine because they take jobs from real Americans, Esperanza reported one afternoon. her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone children used to relay adult cruelties they didn't fully understand. Tommy asked me if that meant my mum was fake. These moments pierced Margaret's heart with their casual revelation of the psychological burden that political rhetoric placed on children. Esperanza was learning to navigate a world where her mother's worth was constantly questioned, where her own belonging was treated as debatable, where playground conversations could carry the weight of national policy debates. "What did you tell Tommy?" Margaret asked gently. "I told him my mum teaches people to read, which seems pretty real to me, and that she makes the best poopuses in the whole neighborhood, which is definitely real because he ate 3 of them at the community center potluck." The child's logic was irrefutable, and her ability to respond to prejudice with concrete examples of her mother's contributions spoke to a wisdom that adults often lost in abstract political arguments. But Margaret worried about the cumulative effect of these daily challenges to Esperanza's sense of security and belonging. The phone calls had started 2 weeks after the restraining order was served. Rosa's cracked cell phone would ring at odd hours, 2 in the morning during her lunch break at the community center, while she was helping Esperanza with homework. When she answered, silence. When she didn't answer, no voicemail, but the pattern was clear. Someone was monitoring her schedule, noting when she was available to be frightened. The police say they can't trace calls unless he actually makes threats. Maria Santos explained during her weekly check-in. Silent calls don't violate the restraining order, even though we all know who's making them. This was the gap between legal protection and practical safety that women fleeing domestic violence knew intimately. The law could prohibit specific actions, but it couldn't prevent the psychological warfare that skilled abusers used to maintain control over their victims' lives. Miguel was demonstrating that he could reach Rosa whenever he wanted, that her new life remained subject to his interference, that the restraining order was just paper. Margaret found herself praying with new urgency, asking for wisdom about how to protect a family that remained vulnerable despite every official safeguard they had secured. The chapel's role as sanctuary felt both more important and more precarious than ever, a thin line of protection between Rosa and Esperanza, and someone who seemed determined to drag them back into violence. The crisis of faith that had been building for weeks finally surfaced during evening prayer. "God, I need to know if what we're doing is right," Margaret whispered into the empty chapel. "These people are looking to me for protection I'm not sure I can provide. If something happens to them because I promised safety I couldn't guarantee." The prayer remained unfinished, hanging in the silence like an accusation. 40 years of ministry had taught Margaret to trust in divine guidance, but the stakes of this situation felt different. Rosa and Esperanza's lives hung in the balance, and the community that had rallied to support them was beginning to fracture, under the pressure of conflicting loyalties and fears. Outside, Mrs. Chen's motion sensor light flickered on as a cat moved through the garden. Inside, Margaret clutched her mother's damaged rosary and prayed for the kind of courage that her grandmother had needed when she crossed an ocean with nothing but faith and determination to build a better life for her children. Sister Margaret was filing parish records when Rosa appeared in her office doorway, moving with the particular stillness that preceded devastating revelations. It was Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the restraining order had been served, and Rosa had just returned from her meeting with Maria Santos about the progress of her immigration case. "Sister, I need to tell you something," Rosa said, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone who had been hollowed out by shame. "Something I should have told you from the beginning, but I was too afraid." Margaret gestured to the chair, across from her desk, noting how Rosa positioned herself near the door, despite weeks of feeling safe at St. Catherine's. Whatever Rosa needed to confess was significant enough to trigger her old patterns of hypervigilance. "The lawyer, she asked me questions today about Miguel's background, about why I was so afraid to go to police from the beginning." Rosa's hands twisted in her lap, and she couldn't meet Margaret's eyes. I told her the truth, and she said I had to tell you too, because it changes everything about our safety. A cold dread began settling in Margaret's stomach. What kind of background? Miguel is... Rosa's voice broke, and she had to start again. Miguel is a retired police officer. 25 years with the city force. That's why I could never report the abuse. That's why I knew the restraining order wouldn't protect us. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Everything they had, built over the past 2 months, the legal strategy, the community support, the careful coordination with local police, suddenly revealed itself as potentially useless against someone who understood the system from the inside. "How long has he been retired?" Margaret asked, her mind racing through the implications. 3 years, but he still has friends on the force, still gets invited to department parties. When I threatened to call police the first time he hit me, he showed me pictures from a recent barbecue with half the officers in our district. He said they would never believe me over him. The revelation recontextualized everything Rosa had told them about her reluctance to seek official help. It wasn't just immigration status that had made her afraid of police. It was the well-founded fear that Miguel's connections would turn any official intervention into another weapon he could use against her. Margaret thought about the officers who had responded to their initial security consultations, their professional reassurances about restraining order enforcement, their promises to prioritize any calls from St. Catherine's. How many of them? And you, Miguel, personally, how many would hesitate to arrest a retired colleague on the word of an undocumented immigrant? There's more, Rosa continued, her voice barely above a whisper. The reason he was so confident about controlling me, about knowing that I would never successfully leave him, he told me stories about other women who had tried to report him. Women whose complaints disappeared, whose credibility was questioned until they gave up and dropped the charges. The pattern Rosa described was horrifyingly familiar to anyone who had worked with domestic violence cases involving law enforcement. Officers, police departments were notoriously reluctant to investigate their own members, and the blue wall of silence that protected officers from accountability in other contexts extended to domestic abuse situations as well. Did you know any of these other women? One, Carla Martinez, who cleaned offices in the same building where I worked. She tried to get help when Miguel started dating her sister, but no one would listen. She showed me the police report where they wrote that she seemed emotionally unstable and possibly motivated by jealousy. 6 months later, her sister was in the hospital with a broken jaw. Sister Margaret felt sick. The scope of Miguel's abuse was far broader than they had understood, and his ability to manipulate official systems meant that conventional approaches to protection were not just inadequate. They were potentially dangerous. Why didn't you tell us this before? Because I was afraid you would decide it was too risky to help us. Because I thought maybe if we could just stay quiet and hidden, we could avoid the parts of the system he controls. Rosa finally looked up, tears streaming down her face. But the lawyer says there's no way to pursue legal status without his connections eventually finding out, and when they do, she didn't need to finish the sentence. If Miguel learned about Rosa's immigration case, her teaching job, her growing community connections, he would have multiple avenues for sabotage. He could pressure his former colleagues to investigate St. Catherine's for harboring undocumented immigrants. He could report Rosa's employment to immigration authorities. He could use his law enforcement contacts to monitor her movements and communication. Margaret stood and moved to the window overlooking Mrs. Chen's garden, needing a moment to process the complete reframing of their situation. Everything she had interpreted as protective, the restraining order, the police consultations, the legal proceedings, now seemed like potential vulnerabilities that Miguel could exploit. "Show me," she said quietly. Rosa looked confused. "Show? You what?" His police badge, the pictures from department events, whatever evidence you have of his connections. If we're going to protect you and Esperanza, I need to understand exactly what we're up against." Rosa reached into her purse and pulled out a small cloth pouch that she had been carrying since the day she arrived at St. Catherine's. Inside was a police badge, retired but still official-looking, engraved with Miguel's name and shield number. Beneath it were several photographs: Miguel in uniform at what appeared to be a retirement party, Miguel with a group of officers at a holiday celebration, Miguel receiving some kind of commendation from a police chief Margaret recognized from local news coverage. The badge felt heavier in Margaret's hands than its size would suggest. This piece of metal represented authority, credibility, institutional protection, all the things that Rosa lacked and that Miguel could weaponize against her. It explained why Rosa had moved through the world with the particular fear of someone who knew that the people others turned to for protection might be the very people who would deliver her back to her abuser. "Maria Santos says we need to completely change our strategy," Rosa continued. "Instead of working within local systems, we need to find ways around them. Federal oversight, state-level advocacy, maybe even media attention to create accountability pressure." The implications were staggering. Everything they had built at St. Catherine's, the relationships with local police, the discreet community support, the careful legal maneuvering, had been constructed on the assumption that they were dealing with a private citizen who might violate laws but wouldn't be able to manipulate law enforcement response. Now they understood that they were essentially trying to protect Rosa and Esperanza from someone who retained significant influence over the very systems designed to provide that protection. "There's something else," Rosa said, reaching for Margaret's hands with desperate urgency. "Yesterday, when I was walking home from the community center, I saw a police car parked across from the chapel, not responding to a call, just sitting there. When the officer saw me notice him, he drove away, but I got a good look at his face, and I've seen him in Miguel's photographs." The surveillance meant that Miguel knew exactly where Rosa was living, what her daily routines looked like, and which community members were supporting her. It also meant that he was confident enough in his protection from official consequences to use active duty officers to monitor someone who had a restraining order against him. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath everything she thought she understood about their situation. The chapel's role as sanctuary suddenly seemed naive rather than sacred. What protection could St. Catherine's offer against someone who had spent 25 years learning how to circumvent the very laws meant to protect vulnerable people? What does Maria Santos recommend we do? She says we need to disappear, new identities, relocation to a different state, maybe even a different country. She has connections with organizations that help women escape law enforcement abusers, but it means giving up everything we've built here. The teaching job, Esperanza's school, the community that's become our family. The choice Rosa described was devastating: abandon the life they had carefully constructed at St. Catherine's, or remain vulnerable to someone whose law enforcement connections made conventional protection meaningless. As Margaret processed this impossible decision, she realized that her 40 years of ministry had not prepared her for this particular moral complexity. She had faced challenges to faith, resources, and institutional support, but never before had she discovered that the very systems she trusted to protect the vulnerable might be actively working against them. The police badge sat on her desk like an accusation, representing everything broken about a justice system that protected its own members while abandoning the people it was meant to serve. And somewhere in the neighborhood, Miguel was waiting with the patience of someone who knew that institutional power was on his side. Sister Margaret sat at her small desk in the pre-dawn darkness, writing what might be her final letter as a nun, in good standing with the Catholic Church. The handwritten pages accumulated slowly, each word chosen with the care of someone who understood that this document would determine not just her immediate future, but the legacy of 40 years devoted to service. "Your Excellency," she began, addressing Bishop Martinez with the formal respect required by protocol, even as she prepared to explain actions that would likely be viewed as insubordination. "I write to inform you of decisions I have made regarding the protection of vulnerable individuals under the care of St. Catherine's Chapel, and to accept full responsibility for any consequences that may follow." The letter outlined everything: Rosa and Esperanza's situation, Miguel's law enforcement connections, the failure of conventional protective measures, and the underground network of clergy and advocates who had agreed to help facilitate what amounted to a modern underground railroad for abuse survivors. Father Thomas Riley had driven down from Boston the previous evening, bringing with him the credentials and connections that made extraordinary action possible. Margaret had known Thomas since seminary. They had entered religious life in the same year, sustained by shared idealism about the Church's role in protecting the vulnerable. Now, 38 years later, Thomas directed a discreet network of Catholic institutions that provided sanctuary for people who couldn't find safety through official channels. "We've been doing this work for 15 years, Thomas had explained during their midnight meeting in Margaret's office. Domestic violence survivors whose abusers have law enforcement connections, undocumented immigrants facing deportation to countries where they'll be killed, whistleblowers whose lives are threatened by powerful interests. The Church has always offered sanctuary to people fleeing persecution. We're just adapting ancient traditions to modern realities." The network Thomas described operated with the knowledge and unofficial blessing of progressive bishops across the Northeast, but always with the understanding that if exposed, individual clergy would face discipline while the Church hierarchy maintained plausible deniability. It was a system that protected vulnerable people while allowing the institution to avoid official confrontation with law enforcement and immigration authorities. "What exactly are you proposing?" Margaret had asked. "New identities for Rosa and Esperanza, placement in a community 3 states away, where Rosa can teach and Esperanza can continue her education. Legal advocacy through federal rather than local channels, which bypasses Miguel's local connections, and temporary separation from everything they've built here until it's safe to return, if it ever is." The plan would unfold over the next 48 hours. Rosa and Esperanza would spend the weekend at a retreat center outside the city, ostensibly attending a religious education conference. On Monday morning, they would not return to St. Catherine's. Instead, they would begin new lives with new names in a community that specialized in helping domestic violence survivors rebuild their lives. Margaret understood that her role in facilitating this disappearance would likely end her career at St. Catherine's and possibly her standing as a nun. The bishop had been clear in previous conversations that the Church could not be seen as actively subverting law enforcement, even in cases where that law enforcement was compromised. By helping Rosa and Esperanza escape through unofficial channels, Margaret was crossing a line that would be difficult to uncross. "I cannot in good conscience allow a mother and child to remain vulnerable to someone who has demonstrated both the will and the means to cause them harm," she wrote in her letter to the bishop. "If protecting the innocent requires me to choose between institutional policies and moral imperatives, I choose to err on the side of love." The letter would be delivered after Rosa and Esperanza were safely relocated, ensuring that Church officials could honestly claim ignorance of the plan until it was complete. Margaret sealed the envelope and placed it in her desk drawer, next to her mother's damaged rosary and the drawing Esperanza had made of a house without windows. Friday evening brought the last normal dinner the 3 of them would share. Rosa had prepared pupusas with Mrs. Chen's vegetables, and Esperanza had set the table in Margaret's small apartment with the careful attention to detail that she brought to all her tasks. The child didn't know that this was goodbye. The plan required maintaining normal routines until the last possible moment to avoid arousing Miguel's suspicions. "Sister Margaret," Esperanza said as they shared the simple meal, "when I grow up, I want to help children like you help us. Is there a job for that?" The question pierced Margaret's heart with its innocence and determination. This remarkable child had absorbed the lessons of sanctuary and service despite, or perhaps because of, her exposure to violence and fear. Her desire to transform her own suffering into service for others represented the kind of redemption that made faith worthwhile. There are many jobs like that, sweetheart. Teachers, social workers, doctors, lawyers who help immigrants, people who run shelters for families who need safe places to stay. The most important qualification is a heart that cares about others, and you already have that. After dinner, Margaret helped Esperanza with her weekend homework, while Rosa packed a single bag with clothes and essential documents. The packing had to appear routine. A weekend trip shouldn't require extensive luggage. But Rosa was essentially choosing which pieces of their old life could be carried into their new one. The photographs were the hardest decision. Rosa had managed to save a few pictures from El Salvador, Esperanza as a baby, Rosa's parents who had died before they could meet their granddaughter, images of the school where Rosa had taught before violence forced them to flee. These represented the only tangible connections to the life they had built before trauma scattered it across borders and years. "Take them," Margaret advised. "Identity isn't just about legal documents. It's about knowing where you come from and what you've survived." Saturday morning brought the arrival of Father Thomas's van, unmarked and ordinary-looking despite its extraordinary purpose. Margaret had arranged for Rosa and Esperanza to attend what appeared to be a routine church retreat, complete with registration, forms, and a schedule of activities that would provide cover for their absence over the weekend. "This feels wrong," Rosa said as they prepared to leave. "Lying to people who have been so kind to us, disappearing without explanation, leaving you to face whatever consequences come." "Sometimes the right thing requires wrong methods," Margaret replied, drawing on wisdom that 40 years of ministry had taught her. "Mrs. Chen will understand when the time comes to explain. Father Rodriguez knows enough to support whatever story becomes necessary, and I'm not facing consequences. I'm accepting them. There's a difference." The hardest moment came when Esperanza hugged Margaret goodbye, the child's thin arms clinging with the intensity of someone who sensed that this parting carried unusual weight. "I'll see you on Monday, right, Sister Margaret?" "I'll see you again," Margaret promised, choosing words that were true, even if the timeline was uncertain. "And wherever you go, remember that you are loved, and that you deserve every good thing this world has to offer." As the van pulled away from St. Catherine's, Margaret felt the familiar mixture of grief and purpose that had marked every major transition in her religious life. She was losing people she had come to love, sacrificing the daily joy of watching Esperanza grow and witnessing Rosa's healing. But she was also ensuring that their story would continue beyond the reach of someone who had tried to write its ending in violence. The remainder of Saturday passed in careful normalcy. Margaret maintained her usual schedule, attended to routine, parish business, and gave no indication that anything extraordinary was unfolding. Mrs. Chen stopped by with vegetables from her garden, and they shared coffee while discussing plans for the community center's upcoming fundraiser. "Rosa and Esperanza seem happier lately," Mrs. Chen observed, with the casual insight that came from years of watching people carefully. "There's less fear in how they move through the world." "They're building confidence," Margaret agreed. finding their place in community, discovering that they have contributions to make and gifts to share. It wasn't exactly lying. Both observations were true, even if they described a process that was about to be interrupted by geographical relocation and identity change. Sunday's Mass carried particular poignancy, though Margaret was the only one who understood why. She looked out over the congregation that had become her extended family, knowing that her role in their lives was about to change dramatically. Some would support her choices when the truth emerged. Others would feel betrayed by her deception. All would be forced to grapple with questions about the relationship between law and morality, safety and justice, institutional loyalty and individual conscience. Father Rodriguez delivered the homily with his usual gentle wisdom, speaking about the biblical injunction to welcome strangers and protect the vulnerable. Sometimes, he said, faithfulness requires us to take risks that make others uncomfortable. The call to love our neighbors doesn't come with guarantees of safety or approval. Margaret wondered if he had chosen these words knowing what was coming, or if the Spirit sometimes moved through human intuition to provide exactly the message that people needed to hear. As Sunday evening approached, Margaret made her final preparations. Letters of explanation to key community members, instructions for Father Rodriguez about ongoing programs, and contact information for the social services network that would continue supporting other families in need. The phone call would come. Monday evening, a brief conversation confirming that Rosa and Esperanza had arrived safely at their destination and were beginning the process of rebuilding their lives with new identities and renewed hope. After that call, Margaret would deliver her letter to the bishop and accept whatever consequences followed, from choosing love over law, sanctuary over safety, and moral conviction over institutional convenience. Monday evening arrived with the kind of stillness that often preceded storms. Sister Margaret sat in her office, supposedly reviewing the week's parish schedule, but actually listening for the phone call that would confirm Rosa and Esperanza's safe arrival at their new home. The silence felt heavy with anticipation and dread, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The sound of car doors slamming in the parking lot shattered the quiet at exactly 7:15. Margaret looked through her window and felt her blood turn cold. Miguel's truck sat under the newly installed security lights, and the man himself was striding toward the chapel's main entrance with the confident gait of someone who expected doors to open for him. He wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, one in civilian clothes, but with the bearing of law enforcement, another in what appeared to be an off-duty police uniform. The casual coordination of their approach suggested this wasn't an impulsive visit, but a planned operation. Margaret reached for her phone to call Father Rodriguez, then hesitated. If Miguel's companions were active duty officers involving other clergy, might only expand the scope of whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Instead, she slipped Father Thomas's car keys into her pocket, the keys that represented Rosa and Esperanza's path to freedom, and walked to the front door. Miguel was already pounding on the heavy oak when she opened it, his fist raised for another blow. In person, he was larger than Margaret had imagined, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with the kind of physical presence that had probably served him well during his police career. His eyes held the flat calculation of someone accustomed to intimidating others into compliance. "Where is she?" he demanded without preamble. "I know Rosa's here. I know you've been hiding her and my kid." "Good evening, Mr." Margaret began, maintaining the formal politeness that had served her through decades of difficult pastoral encounters. "Cut the crap, sister. I'm Miguel Herrera, retired police, and I'm here for my family. Rosa has a restraining order against me, sure, but that doesn't give you the right to help her kidnap my daughter." The legal distortion was breathtaking in its audacity. Miguel was reframing his stalking and harassment as legitimate parental concern, positioning himself as the victim of maternal alienation rather than the perpetrator of domestic violence. It was exactly the kind of manipulation that made law enforcement reluctant to intervene in domestic disputes involving their own members. "I'm Sister Margaret. Rosa and Esperanza attended a church retreat this weekend. They're not here." "Don't lie to me." Miguel pushed past her into the chapel, his companions following without invitation. "I know they live in your basement. I know Rosa's been teaching at your immigrant center, and I know you've been filling their heads with ideas about independence and legal status." The casual violation of sanctuary struck Margaret with physical force. St. Catherine's had been a place of welcome for 40 years, but Miguel's presence transformed it into something that felt contaminated and unsafe. His companions spread out to search the building, their movements suggesting familiarity with tactical operations. "You have no right to search this building without a warrant," Margaret said, summoning the authority that came from 4 decades of defending vulnerable people. Miguel laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Sister, let me explain how this works. I've got 25 years on the force and about 50 friends who'd vouch for my character. You've got a restraining order filed by an undocumented immigrant who's been living illegally in your basement. Who do you think the courts are going to believe?" The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had spent years learning how to work within system loopholes. Miguel understood that institutional bias would favor his version of events over Rosa's, especially if he could frame the situation as involving immigration violations and parental alienation. "Rosa and Esperanza are not here," Margaret repeated, her voice steady, despite the fear building in her chest. "And even if they were, your restraining order prohibits you from approaching them. The restraining order is based on lies told by a woman desperate to stay in the country." Miguel's companion in civilian clothes spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being believed. "Detective Morrison, County Sheriff's Department. We have reason to believe you're harboring fugitives from justice." The introduction revealed the scope of Miguel's connections. This wasn't just local police corruption. He had allies in multiple law enforcement agencies who were willing to frame Rosa's legal immigration case as criminal activity. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she recognized the impossible position Miguel had maneuvered her into. If she continued to deny knowledge of Rosa and Esperanza's whereabouts, she was lying to law enforcement officers. If she admitted to helping them escape, she was confessing to obstruction of justice. If she tried to explain the domestic violence context, her words would be filtered through the institutional loyalty that protected police officers from accountability. "I want to see a warrant," she said, knowing that procedural demands were her only remaining protection. "We don't need a warrant for a welfare check on a missing child," Detective Morrison replied smoothly. "Esperanza Morales is 7 years old and hasn't been seen since Friday. Her father has legitimate concerns about her safety." The reframing was masterful in its manipulation of legal terminology. Miguel had transformed his stalking into parental concern, Rosa's protection into kidnapping, and Margaret's sanctuary into criminal harboring. By involving child welfare language, he had created grounds for a search that would be difficult to challenge legally. Margaret realized with growing horror that Miguel's plan was more sophisticated than simple intimidation. He was creating an official record of events that would support criminal charges against anyone who had helped Rosa and Esperanza escape. This wasn't just about reclaiming control over his victims. It was about punishing everyone who had dared to help them find freedom. As Miguel and his allies moved through St. Catherine's with the methodical efficiency of a coordinated search, Margaret heard a sound that changed everything, the gentle clearing of a throat from the chapel's main entrance. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, her small frame backlit by the parking lot lights, holding a casserole dish and radiating the kind of calm authority that came from 8 decades of experience with human cruelty. "Excuse me," Mrs. Chen said in her precisely accented English, "but I think there may be some confusion here." Miguel spun around, his face showing irritation at the interruption. "Ma'am, this is police business. You need to leave." "Actually," Mrs. Chen replied, stepping fully into the chapel and closing the door behind her with deliberate finality, "this is community business, and I am part of this community." Behind Mrs. Chen, Margaret could see more figures gathering. In the parking lot, Frank Morrison, the retired factory worker who had criticized Margaret's immigration policies, Carmen Rodriguez from the community center, Dr. Martinez, who had treated Rosa's injuries, a dozen other neighbors who had apparently been watching the confrontation unfold. "Sister Margaret," Mrs. Chen continued, her voice carrying across the chapel with surprising strength, "I came to return your dish from the potluck, but I see you have visitors. Should I call Father Rodriguez?" The question was clearly coded. Mrs. Chen was offering Margaret a way to escalate the situation, to bring in additional witnesses and support that might complicate Miguel's carefully orchestrated intimidation. "That won't be necessary," Detective Morrison said quickly, recognizing the threat that community involvement posed to their operation. "We're just conducting a routine welfare check." "Welfare check?" Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose with polite confusion. "For whom? I saw Rosa and Esperanza at the retreat registration this morning. Such a lovely family. Rosa was so excited about the educational workshops." Miguel's face darkened. "You're lying, old woman. Rosa and that kid have been living here illegally for months." The insult hung in the air like a slap. Mrs. Chen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of silence that filled the chapel. Margaret had seen this before, the moment when a community decided that a line had been crossed, and collective action was required. "I am 78 years old," Mrs. Chen said with deadly quiet. "I have been called many things by men who thought their authority made them immune to consequences. But I have never been called a liar by someone breaking into my neighbor's church." Through the windows, Margaret could see that the crowd in the parking lot had grown. Word was spreading through the neighborhood with the speed that characterized tight-knit communities when one of their own was threatened. Cell phones were out, recording devices that would capture whatever happened next for posterity and possible legal action. "Ma'am, we have every right to—" Detective Morrison began. "Show me your warrant." Frank Morrison's voice cut through the detective's explanation as the retired factory worker entered the chapel. Despite his earlier criticisms of Margaret's immigration advocacy, Frank's expression showed nothing but contempt for the men who had violated sanctuary. "Show me the paperwork that gives you the right to search a church. We don't need a warrant for—" "Yeah, you do." Carmen Rodriguez appeared behind Frank, her phone held high and clearly recording. "And you need probable cause, which you don't. And you need to respect the fact that this is a house of worship with constitutional protections." Miguel's carefully orchestrated intimidation was dissolving into something far more complicated. What had been designed as a private confrontation between a retired police officer and an isolated nun was becoming a public standoff between law, enforcement, and an entire community. "Listen, people," Miguel said, attempting to reassert control through volume and authority. "You don't understand what's happening here. That woman has been hiding a kidnapper and her stolen child. Rosa Morales has no legal right to keep my daughter from me." "Esperanza is not your daughter," Dr. Martinez said as he joined the growing crowd inside the chapel. "I've treated that child's injuries from your abuse. I've documented evidence that will hold up in any court that cares about truth over corruption." The Accusation of corruption struck home. Detective Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, a gesture that was immediately noticed by multiple people with recording devices. "Doctor, you're interfering with a police investigation," Morrison warned. "No, Detective, you're interfering with a community protecting its most vulnerable members," came a new voice from the entrance. Father Rodriguez stood in the doorway, his clerical collar clearly visible and his expression carrying the particular authority that came from representing institutional church power. Behind him, Margaret could see even more neighbors, families from 6 different countries speaking 4 different languages, united by shared understanding that what was happening at St. Catherine's threatened everyone's safety. "Gentlemen," Father Rodriguez said, with the calm that came from years of de-escalating crisis situations, "I think it's time for you to leave. Your presence here is causing distress to our community, and you've presented no legal authority for searching church property." Miguel's face was now red with rage and frustration. His carefully planned operation had been derailed by the one thing he hadn't anticipated: a community that would stand together against official intimidation. "This isn't over," he snarled at Margaret. "Rosa can't hide forever. And when I find her, everyone who helped her is going to pay." But even as he made the threat, Miguel was backing toward the door. The crowd outside had grown to nearly 50 people, and their phones were capturing every word for distribution across social media networks that would make any official retaliation highly visible and politically costly. As Miguel and his allies retreated to their vehicles, Margaret realized that Esperanza's voice had indeed become the key to exposing his abuse pattern, not through direct testimony, but through the community response that her family's courage had inspired. The child's simple request to "hide my mother tonight" had revealed truths that no amount of official authority could suppress. 6 months later, Sister Margaret stood in the same chapel where Esperanza had first whispered her desperate plea for sanctuary, holding a document that represented the kind of transformation that made 4 decades of ministry feel worthwhile. The new birth certificate bore Rosa's chosen legal name, Rosa Elena Martinez, symbolizing not just bureaucratic necessity, but genuine rebirth into a life where safety and dignity were rights rather than distant hopes. The disciplinary hearing with Bishop Martinez had unfolded differently than Margaret expected. Rather than facing punishment for her unauthorized actions, she had found herself part of a larger conversation about the Church's role in protecting vulnerable families when official systems failed. The media attention generated by Miguel's confrontation at St. Catherine's had forced diocesan leadership to publicly address their position on sanctuary and social justice. "Sister Margaret," the bishop had said during their private meeting, "your actions place the Church in a difficult position with law enforcement. But they also reminded us that our first obligation is to protect the innocent, regardless of the political complications that may follow." The investigation into Miguel's abuse of authority had moved with surprising speed, once community pressure and media scrutiny made official inaction politically impossible. Detective Morrison faced federal charges for civil rights violations. 3 other officers connected to Miguel's network were under investigation for misconduct in domestic violence cases. And Miguel himself had been arrested on charges ranging from stalking to official corruption, his law enforcement connections now working against rather than for him. Rosa's voice came through clearly on the phone call Margaret received each Sunday evening. Updates from a small college town in Vermont where she was teaching mathematics at a community school while pursuing certification for public education. The transition had been difficult, but Rosa's natural gifts as an educator had quickly earned her respect and belonging in her new community. "Esperanza lost her first tooth last week," Rosa reported during their most recent conversation, her voice carrying the lightness that came from living without fear. She insisted on writing a note to the tooth fairy in both English and Spanish, because she said magical creatures should be bilingual. The image of Esperanza, negotiating with mythical beings in two languages, captured everything hopeful about the child's resilience and adaptation. The trauma hadn't disappeared. Dr. Kim continued providing therapy through video sessions, but it was no longer defining Esperanza's daily experience or limiting her possibilities for the future. She draws houses with windows now, Rosa had added quietly. Big windows with curtains and flower boxes. She says she wants to see the world without being afraid of who might see her. The evolution of Esperanza's artwork from windowless fortress to open, welcoming home marked the healing that became possible when children felt genuinely safe. Margaret kept the original drawing in her prayer journal as a reminder of how trauma could be transformed through community care and sustained protection. St. Catherine's had become a focal point for immigrant advocacy following the confrontation with Miguel. Donations had poured in from supporters across the region, enabling the expansion of ESL programs, legal assistance services, and emergency housing for families in crisis. What had begun as one nun's response to a child's plea had evolved into a comprehensive support network for vulnerable families. Mrs. Chen had emerged as an unlikely community organizer, her gentle authority and practical wisdom making her effective at building bridges between different cultural groups and long-time residents who had initially resisted change. The vegetable garden behind the chapel had expanded into a community space where families from a dozen different countries shared agricultural knowledge and traditional recipes. People are the same everywhere, Mrs. Chen observed during one of their morning coffee conversations. They want safety for their children, dignity in their work, and neighbors who see them as human beings rather than problems to be solved. Frank Morrison had become one of the program's most dedicated volunteers, his change of heart illustrating how personal relationships could overcome abstract political positions. His mechanical skills had proven invaluable for families whose cars needed repair, but whose budgets couldn't afford professional service, and his grandchildren now played regularly with immigrant children in the chapel's expanded playground. I was wrong about Rosa, he'd admitted to Margaret during a recent conversation. I thought helping her meant less help for my family. But it turns out that communities strong enough to protect vulnerable people are strong enough to support everyone. Father Rodriguez had been officially commended by the diocese for his role in what church leadership now described as courageous pastoral care. His steady presence throughout the crisis had provided the institutional stability that allowed Margaret's more radical actions to succeed without destroying the programs that served hundreds of other families. I think we've learned something important about Sanctuary, he reflected during their weekly planning meeting. It's not just about providing temporary shelter, it's about creating communities where people can become who they're meant to be, without fear of violence or rejection. The legal resolution of Rosa's immigration case had taken 18 months, but the outcome exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Her protected status had been granted based on the domestic violence she suffered, and she was now eligible to apply for permanent residency. More importantly, the federal investigation into Miguel's network had established legal precedents that strengthened protections for other women facing similar situations. On this particular evening, as Margaret prepared for the prayers that marked the end of each day, she reflected on the unexpected ways that a child's desperate whisper had transformed not just Rosa and Esperanza's lives, but the entire community that had responded to their need. The chapel doors remained unlocked, just as they had for 40 years, but now that simple policy carried additional weight. The knowledge that a community stood ready to support whatever protection those doors might need to provide. Esperanza's voice echoed in Margaret's memory as she knelt for evening prayer. "Please hide my mother tonight. The request had been answered not through hiding, but through the kind of radical visibility that made continuation of abuse impossible. Tomorrow would bring new families seeking sanctuary, new challenges to faith, and community, new opportunities to choose love over law when the two conflicted. But tonight, Margaret prayed with gratitude for the privilege of witnessing how one child's courage could ripple outward to create safety for countless others, and how the simple act of keeping doors open could become a form of resistance that transformed entire communities. In Vermont, Rosa was tucking Esperanza into bed in a house with windows that looked out onto mountains and possibility. At St. Catherine's, Sister Margaret concluded her prayers and prepared to meet whatever tomorrow's needs might require, sustained by the knowledge that sometimes the most profound acts of faith began with the smallest gestures of welcome.